Welcome back to the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. I've been away from the project for a couple of months now, so if you're new to the project or just getting back into it, this is a great place to start. You see, when you walk away from a project for a while, it tends to kind of slip out of your brain. And so what we're going to do today is approach it as if we're a brand new developer in a project we're not familiar with. And this is a very, very common scenario, and one of the reasons why I created the TimCo Retail Manager series. It's not just about building a cool application, which we're doing, but it's also about simulating the real world and how the real world works. So when you're hired to work at a company and you walk in day one, almost all the time you're walking into an existing project. So how do you get up to speed on that project? How do you review the code? How do you look at it and say, okay, now I understand? Usually it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so today I'm going to show you some kind of tips and shortcuts to make life a little easier when it comes to reviewing a project that you might not be familiar with. Along the way, we're going to familiarize yourself again with the TimCo Retail Manager and kind of see some things with fresh eyes. With that, we're going to find a number of things we could do a lot better, I think. So let's get right into it. But before we do, if you're a Patreon member at the $5 per month level or higher, make sure to go to patreon.com and there'll be a post there with a source code from today's video. That's my gift to you as part of being a Patreon member. All right. And for everybody else, for all of you, I'd appreciate if you give this video a thumbs up and leave any comments about future things you want to see with the TimCo Retail Manager series. Now, there's a lot of bugs we need to address. If you see one, point it out. I've got a bug repository that will help kind of keep track of those things for us. But we also want to think about where to move this course in the future. Do we add things like Blazor WebAssembly now that we have it in a web API? Do we do more things in depth with some design patterns? These are all things to consider. I'd love to have your feedback on it. So make sure you leave a comment down in the comments down below that will let us know and let us interact and discuss what your thoughts are on the directions we should go. Okay? So those are the things. Patreon members, get your source code and also leave a comment down below with what you want to see as far as bugs fixed or features added. And also don't forget to give that thumbs up to the video. Okay, I think that's all the setup work to do. Let's go right over to our website. And I say website because we need to start with getting a source code. You see, since the last video, I have built a whole new machine and started over from scratch with everything. So I did a video on installing Visual Studio so you can see how that works. We're going to use that version of Visual Studio going forward. So I need to get the TimCo Retail Manager code onto my computer and need to get up and running, which is a great time to talk about how that process goes. So I'm over here on my Azure DevOps repository. We have the TimCo Retail Manager, so you can click on that. And in here, I'm going to go to my repos. Now you don't have access to this. This is my private repository. But this is how you kind of work with inside of a private repository for a business. So here I have in my repos, I have all my source code, along with, of course, all the commit history and what's been going on to this point. This can be a really great place to start looking at how does the application evolve over time. It also gives you a good picture of, are the commit messages very good at all? And in fact, the commit message here, add login form error handling. That's about all there is to it. Not really great, but at the same time, it does give us, of course, the source code as to what has changed. So that's what I think about is maybe make your commit messages better, which I've intentionally kept mine quick because that's not really the point of this course and I don't want to drag you through all that time. But it's important to look at those commit messages and have them share something of value. Because as a new developer coming through, I need to be able to understand, how does this work? How does your commit structure work? What kind of commits do you do? What did that commit do? So that if I have to work on fixing the copyright. And I go, okay, there's a commit earlier to fix the copyright here. Well, it'd be great if you explained to me what you thought the fix was. Now I can read through it and say, okay, you removed just 2019, you add a datetime.now.year and the name. Okay, so that maybe gives me a better understanding of what the code does, but maybe there's more to it than that. So those commit messages will be really helpful to improve. That's the first thing I see when I come in here. Now back to the files, let's go ahead and get these files onto my machine. There's a few ways of doing that, and this will work for both Azure DevOps as well as GitHub or any other Git style repository. And that is we have some options up here. We have clone. We also have the ability to download as a zip. We're going to do a clone. And the reason why is because we want to set this repository up as our upstream. This is the easiest way of doing that. Now, if you're not familiar with Git and with upstreams and repositories, all that stuff, essentially what it means is that this will be, for lack of a better word, our server, where our code lives. Now, Git is a decentralized system, meaning there is no central server in theory. But in how we use it, we typically use it as if one machine is the authoritative server. Even though every machine has a full copy of the repository, which is the set of code essentially, we still treat one machine as the central repository, the central place or a central server. That will be Azure DevOps, okay? So we're going to clone. The upstream just means that's where we're going to push our code to. So it makes life a little easier. So I hit clone, and I have a few options here. I could just hit the copy button, which I'm going to do, copy clone URL to clipboard. Or I could actually go to an IDE, for example, Visual Studio, and clone this using Visual Studio. I'm going to prefer to do it at the command line. And the reason why is because I don't think that the Visual Studio does it quite as cleanly as I would appreciate. It's still a little clunky. So we're going to do it at the command line. But here's the problem. If I go to my C repos, which is a folder I created, and I try and do anything with my right click, there's no command line options here. And that's because I haven't installed Git directly. I have Git installed through Visual Studio, but not the full Git with all the options that I like. So I'm going to install Git while we're here. It's kind of a bonus thing. So let's drag this off. I'm going to go to git-scm.com and download the latest version for my operating system, which is Windows. And it's going to start, and by default, it chose the 64-bit version of Git, which is what you should be using. Almost everybody now uses a 64-bit operating system. So if you don't know, that's probably default, is to go to 64-bit. You can go to the system, which is, you right-click on my computer and go to Properties. Go here, go Computer, this PC, right-click and go to Properties. It should tell you in here, notice it says 64-bit operating system. So that tells you Windows 10 Enterprise 64-bit operating system. So there you go. So once that has downloaded, we're going to run that, and let's go through a few of the features it's going to ask us about. And again, I want to have Git installed on my machine. So let's hit next, and we want fast forward or merge. By default, if you don't know, leave the defaults as they are. If you really have a preference, then you can choose. But the defaults are really good. So I'd leave the defaults as they are. And wait for it to install. And then once it installs, it's going to add a couple of right-click options for me, which I really want. And of course it didn't. So let me go restart this application. I'm going to uncheck this box. Since it was installed and didn't give me its options. So I'm going to uncheck the box that says only show new options. And I do want to have the Windows Explorer integration. So let's zoom in here. There we go. I want to have the Windows Explorer integration with Git Bash here and Git GUI here. These are both important to me because I want to have the ability to go to the Git command line at that location. Just makes things a little easier for me. I really like that option. And I don't want Vim as my text editor. I do want Notepad++. It's much easier to use Notepad++ than it is Vim. So I'm going to leave the rest of the defaults as they are. And then I am going to be done. It should go through. Let's zoom back out here. There we go. And it should clear up quite quickly. So once that's done, we should now have the command line option to go directly to Git. So let's launch Git bash just to see it. And there we go. Let's change these defaults here. Options. There we go. And this is tiny. So let's go to text. Let's go to select, and let's change this to 20-point font. Looks good. And let's hit apply. Much better. You can probably read that now. So Git bash is working. Let's close this out. And now if I bring my folder over again, I can say right click and say Git bash here. And that should bring up a location. Notice it says /c/repos. Now this is a bash prompt. It's not a command prompt. It's a little different, but bash does give me a few more options that I like over the traditional just command prompt. So now that I have this here, what I'm going to do is I am going to paste in my cloned URL. I may have lost that when I did the installation. So let's copy that again just to be sure. And now we're going to do a git clone and paste that in. So right click and say paste or shift insert. Notice the URL that it gives me. This is a full URL of my Git location. Now you have to have credentials in order to access this. Just to make sure that I have the correct credentials before we go any further. So I'm going to select my Microsoft account and make sure that since it's already logged in, it uses those credentials. And now I have cloned my repository. So let's open up that folder again. Notice we now have the TimCo Retail Manager. And then in here we have our solution with all our files. That's the way I prefer to do it. Now that may seem a little convoluted and long, but I prefer to do that over going into Visual Studio and trying to clone from there. I just find it's a little clunky. It doesn't always end up where I want it to end up, and I just don't prefer it as much. But if you would rather go that direction, then what you can do is, let's close this out now. Let's move this off. You can just say clone in Visual Studio, and that's going to create a link that's going to ask you, do you want to open this in Visual Studio? You say yes, it opens in Visual Studio, and then it'll give you some of those same options, where to clone it, and so on. So you can do it that way as well. It's up to you. This is just my preferred method. So let's open that. I'll double click it. We'll open it up. It's going to open on the wrong screen, of course, because that's how it always works. I really should have just one screen, but I can't deal with one screen. So there we go. So there's our Visual Studio. And if we open up or expand these folders, we will see that the TRM desktop UI.library is the one that says a startup project. That's going to be the first thing that bites us, okay? But now we at least have the source code downloaded. We can start working on it from here. However, there's a few problems. This is where good documentation comes into play. I did a video recently in my Dev Questions series, and if you haven't checked out the Dev Questions series yet, definitely check that out. It's where I talk about the questions that come up around development. I even have a podcast about it as well. I turn the same content into a podcast. So you can listen to it on your way to work or on the treadmill. But in there, we talked about what is a good code comment. What are comments for? And one thing we came to the conclusion of is that the comments in your code aren't necessarily necessary if you write good, clean code. which is really hard to do. But you really do need to explain the why and the how of using your code. And this is one of the places where the TimCo Retail Manager series is lacking. Because if we go back to our code here, we have this really nice wiki page, this README page that says about this project, full course being developed on YouTube. That's all it says. It even says the language is JavaScript and CSS, which is not quite right. But there's no instructions here on how do you install it? How do you get it to run? How do you set up your development environment? There's no help here. And so as a new developer coming in, you're a little lost because you got to figure it out on your own. And that takes time. So I would encourage you, if you come into an environment that is like this, where there's no startup process, there's no explanation for the startup process, as you're learning it, document it. Not only will that help you in better understand what's going on, but it will help the next person as well. And it's going to make a great first impression to the rest of your team. The fact that you're jumping in and solving a problem that they're just now really thinking about. Because most likely they hadn't thought about that startup cost or that time. And so now you're helping the next person, helping them getting on board faster than you got on board. And if you're working at a team right now, maybe document this process now before you hire someone. So that's just a thought to think through that we need to think through when it comes to this application as well. So how do you get started? Well, one of the things you can do is explore in the user interfaces. So the API is a user interface, and so is the desktop user interface. In both of these, they should have a startup, either an app.config or an appsettings.json file. Now we haven't moved over to the appsettings.json file for our desktop UI. There's something else to think about doing. But we have an app.config. In here, we have a key. It says, okay, the API is at this URL, which includes the 5001. Now, if you're familiar, that indicates to you that the API should be running on a Kestrel installation, not on IIS Express, because Kestrel uses 5001 as the default port every time, versus the IIS Express, which changes the port number for every new project. So we looked there, we saw just this API. We also see the tax rate, which we need to address at some point. That should be moved into a database. But also in appsettings.json, our other user interface, we have two database connections. We have our default connection, which is our API auth database. And then we have our TRM data connection, which is our TRM data database. Well, where do these databases come from? Well, we know that this one is an entity framework, and this is a database that we created called TRM data. It's right here. But the documentation doesn't necessarily say that. So again, it's something we need to think through. How do we set this up properly? So I think that our documentation, which doesn't exist really, but when we do our documentation, we need to make sure that we document how to get your databases set up. Let me walk you through how to set up your databases. Since this may be the first time you've dealt with a TimCo Retail Manager series, that's great. This is a great place to start. We're going to help you kind of get up to speed where the source code is right now. So to get started, we want to generate this TRM data, which is a database with a few tables, a few store procedures, quite a few store procedures. That's about it. So to do that, let's right click and say publish. Okay. And actually we should save this publish profile, which we'll do in just a minute, but let's create it first. So we go to edit on our target database connection. Let's go to browse, go to local, and choose the MS SQL local DB. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with local DB, it's a type of SQL Server installation. You have to have things installed to use it, but it essentially uses files, not the full SQL Server in order to run. So it's a little different, but it does need an installation in order to run. You can't just take the files from one computer to another and just run it. You have to have a SQL Server, at least a local DB type installation running somewhere in order to power this. So I have one here because it installed with Visual Studio. Notice the server name is localDB/MS SQL localDB. The authentication is Windows authentication. There's my username, which is my login, and my password, of course, is blank. And that's because we're going to use trusted authentication. And our database name is default. That's fine. We're hit OK. That's our connection. But now we need to create a database name on that server. Well, our database name should be TRM data. And the published script name will be trmdata.sql. That's fine. Let's save this profile. Now I'm saving this profile. We saved it earlier when I first created it. However, we don't put that into source control because every computer is different. So you don't want to save this in a source control. This also might have passwords in it, which would only be for my local machine, but still don't save that in source control. So we're going to hit save here. And now you'll notice, let's kind of hide this. Notice we now have trmdata.publish.xml. That's now our published profile. But if you look, it's really tiny. There's this little red icon next to it that's a red circle with a dash through it. And that indicates that our source control, which is Git, is not going to save that. It's not going to upload that to our upstream. So that's a good thing. But what this allows us to do is double click this, and now it brings back up all those settings, and I can just hit publish. This will allow me to publish every time I make a change to my database. All right. So with that publish, it has now published to the database. Let's check to make sure by going to SQL Server Object Explorer. If you don't have that, go to View, SQL Server Object Explorer. Now in here, we have, I'm going to really expand it because I've changed the font sizes here to be better for video, but it does make things a lot bigger. So I have localDB/MSSQL localDB. That's the same path. So that's the database we're using. We'll expand that, go to databases, and I only have one database right now. This is a brand new machine, so we're just starting out. I'll have tons of them eventually. But TRM data, there we go. So there's our tables. There's our store procedures. So we're all set. If we look at products though, view data, there's no data in the products table because there's no data in any of our tables. We haven't set that up really. So that's something to think through and work through in a minute. But let's start with just getting the other database up and running. The other database is our entity framework database. So how do you get an entity framework database up and running? Well, we go to the View menu, and you go to Other Window, and we look for the Package Manager console. Now, if you already have this open, great, you just open it up. But I don't have it open, so I'm going to open that up. And it's got Initialize PowerShell. And by default, it has selected the library project. We could change that if we wanted to, but that's just for package source. The problem here is if you try to update the database, even if you have a default project selected here as the API, if you say update database, you're going to get an error. And so that's going to be all red and you're confused and not sure why this is. There you go. It says startup project of desktop UI.library targets the framework of .NET Standard. There is no runtime associated with this framework, and the project targeted cannot be executed directly. And so you may go down this road of, well, how do I do this? How do I execute this project? It's kind of a red herring, which is ironic since the code's red. But what this is it's saying, hey, I can't start this library. That's not what you want it to do anyway. Instead, you want it to be running the API to look for our entity framework. So right-click on the API and set as startup project. Now, update database. Build succeeded, and now we're updating our database. Now, what's happening here? Because Entity Framework can sometimes be a magic box that things just kind of happen. And that's easy what's happening here. We're scrolling through lots of stuff and you're saying, I don't know what's going on. It just doesn't, right? Well, what this is doing is it is looking at our connections, so our default connections, what Entity Framework uses, and it's looking for this path and say, okay, there's the path to the database, which means that this server must exist. You can't just specify a non-existent server. But this database does not have to exist. It can, or it might not. And that's okay. If it doesn't exist, it will get created as long as the server exists and as long as the user who is authenticated has access to create a database on that server. So those are the things to watch out for. So since I am an administrator on that server, even though this did not exist, if we go to SQL Server Object Explorer, we go to Databases and we hit Refresh, we'll now see we have two databases. One of them is an API Auth DB. That's our Entity Framework database with all the tables, views, and stored procedures we need to do authentication. So we're getting closer, but there's nobody in here. If we go to users and look at data, there's no users. So there also is no administrator. Well, we need to set up an administrator. So let's figure out how to do that. Well, if you remember, this is where, again, great documentation would be helpful. We don't have any documentation, so we got to remember, go to the Wayback Machine and try and figure this out. Fortunately, I have everything on video, so if you want to go back and look for yourself, you can. But if we go to the controllers and go to the home controller and look at the home controller, I believe, yes, under privacy, we have all this code that's commented out. And this code does two things. This is where reading code is helpful. Now, if you want to grow as a developer, one of the ways to do that is to read other people's code, to learn to read code so that you can kind of understand what's going on and trace down the logic of what's happening. So let's read through this code, which is commented out. In fact, I'll uncomment it so we have some better highlighting here. So let's uncomment that. There we go. So the first we have this array called roles, which we're adding 3 hard-coded values to: admin, manager, and cashier. And then for each of those values in that array, we're going to say, does the role exist? And if the role does not exist, that equals false, then we're going to create that role. So we're going to create these 3 roles in our database. Once we're done that, then we're going to say, let's find by email this user. Well, that user's me. That's hard-coded, which is not great, but that's hard-coded to my email address. That's our admin email address. We need to move that off into a config section somewhere and not have this commented out. But for now, it is what it is. So we're going to look for this user. And if this user is there, so it's not null, then add to roles async, admin, and cashier. So make Tim, I am Tim Corey, both an admin and a cashier. So if I were to download this on my machine, then I need to make sure that I created a user called TimIamTimCorey.com, even if I wasn't Tim, because that's who's going to be set up as the admin if you go to the privacy path on the home controller. Okay, so we're going to make sure that's in place. And then we're going to run just the API. Now, the API is selected as a startup project. Right now, it's IS Express. Let's change this to the Kestrel, which is TRM API. Kestrel is the command prompt style look and feel. It's going to create that port that is standard. So let's launch this. And we get this error message right here. Now, this is a new installation of Visual Studio. And so it says This project is configured to use SSL, which is a good thing. We want to test SSL. You can avoid SSL warnings in the browser by creating a trusted self-signed certificate. Do you want to do that? Do you want to trust the ASP.core SSL certificate? Why, yes, I do. And let's check the box here. It says, don't ask me again. Always trust the local SSL certificate. Now, this does mean this is a self-signed certificate. That's not a secure thing to do if you are going to do it in production. But we're not doing it in production. We're doing this in development. So this is a great thing to do because it allows us to test for free SSL without having to create a developer certificate that's expensive or configure a lot of things and make sure you set them up and make sure we renew it every year and all the rest of the stuff. We can just set this up and have it work. But this will cause a couple of quirky issues, like Postman will have an issue with our SSL certificate because it's a self-signed certificate. Understandably, Postman doesn't like self-signed certificates because they're unsafe. But Postman's worrying about production, not about development. So don't worry about that for testing development things, okay? That's what I'm saying. So hit yes here, and now we have an SSL certificate. You'll also get this warning right here. You're about to install a certificate from a certification authority claiming to represent localhost. It can't be validated. If you install this root certificate, Windows will automatically trust any certificate issued by this CA, which is a certification authority, which we're saying we're our own authority. And that's okay, okay? You'd only say yes to this, though, for a development certificate, for development use. This is not for production. Just trying to be clear here. So yes, I want to trust this. All right, so now Kestrel is starting up, and now our API is starting up. Cool. So let's go to register. I'm going to register a new user. So Tim, my super secret password, and register. And it says, hey, this app does not currently have a real email sender registered, which is a good thing. We're in development mode. We don't want a real email sender registered. Otherwise, we'll be sending real email for our test system. That wouldn't be good. So in this case, we just click here to confirm your account. It's going to mark our account as confirmed. Normally, you'd send an email out to the account and say, hey, click on this link to confirm that you are who you say you are. In this case, it's done for us. Now they've created that account, we're going to privacy. Remember we had to create that tim@imtimcorey.com account. Now you have privacy, and we've gone to that page. It's now set up our roles. That was very, very quick. But let's verify that it happened. So let's close out of this. Let's go to SQL Server Object Explorer, go to roles, and go to view data. And there's 3 roles now. Admin, cashier, and manager. Let's go back here and let's look at user roles to see if there's any users in the roles. And in fact, there is 2 roles that have the same user ID associated with both of them. So that'd be my user ID, F0E. So if we look at that and we go to users, you should see that my user ID starts with F0E. So now we've got everything set up so that I can log in as myself. Okay, now, again, we haven't figured out how to, what this thing does yet. We're kind of still working on knowledge that's been passed down to us. Now, it's been passed down from my previous self, but if you came to this organization new, I'd have to tell you how to do this because it's not documented. It really needs to be documented. This is where documentation really shines, is if you have a step 1, 2, 3, 4 to get yourself set up as working in development, that'd be awesome, okay? And so we want to get to that point. We may even do that. I'm not sure if I'll do it on camera, if I'll just do it for you and then we'll talk through it. We don't want to bore you, but at the same time, good documentation is worth its weight in gold. So this is another place where if we didn't have documentation, we wouldn't know what to do next. But I do know that we should probably have some products in the database. We don't, but we probably should. So let's go over to our database, go to products, and let's go to view data. Right now, there's no product, no description, retail price, quantity, and then create date, last modified is taxable. So let's create a couple products. So let's go with Finish by John A. Cuff. The book to read. Seriously, it is. If you haven't read Finish yet, please do so. It will change your career. Let's put 10 of those in stock. And there we go. I hit down arrow to create that record. So now I have one record in stock. Now let's create a second record. Let's create 8 AA N loop batteries. The best rechargeable batteries out there. And seriously, they are. So let's change that to be 5 in stock. That's good enough for now. Those are the two things we have in stock. We have N-loop batteries, and we have the book Finish by John A. Cuff. So that gets us started. So now we have products in the database, but how do we test this out? How do we make sure that we're working the way we should? Well, let's first start with testing the API on its own. So let's launch this again. We'll launch up Kestrel. We'll launch this, and we need to use the API. Now, we can go here, Swagger, but one of the things we've noticed, and it's been pointed out, and I believe it's on our list of things to fix, and if not, it should be, is that this Swagger is kind of messed up now. We upgraded from .NET Framework to .NET Core, and Swagger didn't fully come with us the way with all of our settings. So we need to make some adjustments to this because there's no way to authenticate this. Notice we hit try this out and say execute. We get a 401 not authorized, which is not documented as well. Oops. But we're looking for the inventory. We can't get that. Well, we go to product, which no product is there. So try that out, execute. Again, 401 error, which is not authorized. So we're getting errors because we're not authorized. And there's no way to authorize through here. There's not a way of passing a token. This is where we should bring in Postman. So let's open Postman. If you're not familiar with Postman, getpostman.com is the place to get this for free. I own this. It's amazing. It's free to use. You can, I believe, there's some paid options here, but I just use a free account for now. Yep, there's an upgrade. But I'm not even sure what all that does. But this team is definitely worth supporting. They've done a great thing. They've offered a lot of cool stuff. I probably will end up supporting them just because of the fact that they do some cool stuff. Okay, so you can Postman Business is $288. Postman Team is $144. So just note they do have that option out there, but the version is free to use. And it's a pretty cool tool. So let's go ahead and we're going to close the Launchpad down. I'm just going to create a quick connection here. And I want to go to that API/product. So I'm going to say HTTPS localhost :5001/API/product. However, I need to authorize myself because if I just hit send on this, it's going to come back with a 401 unauthorized. So how do I do that? Well, in Postman, it's actually gotten pretty easy. You go authorization, and you say, okay, which type of authorization are we using? Well, we're using OAuth 2.0. So let's grab a token. Well, I need to get a new access token. Okay, because this one probably won't work. That's from a previous thing I was doing, and I'm betting that won't work. Well, let's get a new access token. So let's go to, most of the stuff's probably about the same. I was using it for a different project. So I am Tim Corey. Let's make sure the password is correct. And we're going to leave the rest of this stuff empty. And we're going to say, just get me my token. So /token, that's the path to our token, request token, and it says here that not found in response, which is weird. I gotta look into why this is, because it is in response. It's right here. So I'm not quite sure why it didn't find it in response. Now, if you're quick and you copy all that stuff down, you could authorize against my local machine. Cool. But don't worry, it's gonna go away. So I'm gonna paste that in here. But the cool thing is, notice the header prefix, add the authorization header of bearer. Remember, you have to put bearer in front of token. I always forget that. But this way, it's done for me. So now I have this authorization of OAuth 2, which is the access token, the prefix, and if I hit send now, I get a 200 OK. And if we zoom in down here, we'll see that I have 8 end loop batteries, and I have the book finished by John Acuff. So quantity in stock is 10, quantity in stock is 5. We're good to go. I mean, we're getting information from our API based upon our logged in user. Cool. So Postman now works. All right, so we can close that out. And we can close out the API itself. And now let's set up to get WPF to work. Well, again, documentation would be helpful here, but we right click on the solution and we say set startup projects. And in here, instead of having one startup project, we're gonna have multiple. We want the API, we're gonna start that, and then we're gonna start the desktop UI. Now, let's see if I can zoom in a little bit here. These are a little small, but I can't really make them bigger, sorry. This order is important. So we're gonna start this one first, the API first, and then start the desktop UI. If they were out of order, you can use the up and down arrow to move which one goes where. Notice I've moved the desktop UI up to right below the API. So if you had this switched, where the desktop UI launched first, then the API, the problem would be is the API would be not available if you, in the time before it started, you hit go to log in. So just make sure you start in the right order. Some things are a little more dependent on order than others. This one's not the end of the world if you get it wrong, but it's helpful to do it right. So I hit OK. And now when I hit start, multiple projects will start. So we're going to start with our API is going to log in, and we have our WPF project. And we have this bar here, which I'm not a fan of this bar. You can shrink it down a little bit, but I'm not a fan of it. You can use it to kind of debug WPF, but I've never really found that that's been my problem, okay? It's not like a web application where I've found that that's really helpful. Some people love it. I get that. And if you do, cool. I just find it annoying. So we'll get rid of that in a minute. But for right now, let's just leave it there. We'll hit log in. Now this is hard-coded, and it says, no, you can't log in. You may first think, well, maybe that password's wrong. I'll give you a hint, that password's not wrong. This is something else. And this is where, again, documentation would have helped us, because we wouldn't get to this point if we had documented it properly. It says sequence contains no elements. Well, what sequence is that? Well, that's an error whenever you try and do a first on a list that comes back. And if there's nothing in a list, you can't do a first. So get user by ID. That's been failing, okay? Now, first of all, we probably should handle that error better. But let's make a note of that, and then let's come back to it in a minute. But for now, or maybe come back to it, you know what? Write that down. We'll put it on our bug list. I should do it right now, but I want to keep going this video so I don't make it too terribly long. I'm going to hit Control F12. The F12 should go to the interface. Notice the interface right there? That's not really helpful. But if I hit Control F12, and whoops, where was I? I just closed out the window that I need to have open. Don't you love how when you do that? So let's do this. Let's do the step into it should break, and it's going to dispose. Let's just start over. If you do that, I close out this right here, which is this tab right here is things that are open temporarily. And so if you open a new thing temporarily, it goes to that instead, and you have to hit the back arrow to go to the previous one. So I should have done that back arrow and gone to user controllers. But let's hit start again. We'll do the same thing all over again. We're going to log into our WPF application. It's going to throw the same error, the same spot. Notice it's right here. You can also hit this little icon right here and keep tab open. Now that tab is open, I'm not going to lose it if I go somewhere else. So now what I'm going to do is F12 didn't work. F12 went to the interface. So instead, I'm going to do Control F12 to go to the implementation of that interface that we're using. Really helpful stuff here. So now this goes to the user data class in the data access folder of the TRM Data Manager library. So in here, we're loading data. We're saying SP user lookup from the TRM data database. So we're looking up based upon this ID, we're doing a lookup for the user. Well, the user ID is, we can mouse over it, or we can bring it up here and go to our locals window. Actually, auto window has it as well. We have user ID right here. I can copy this user ID, which F03 sound familiar? It should, because that's the user ID of me. So saying it can't find me, which seems odd because it should find me, right? Well, but it's looking in the TRM database, TRM data database. If we go to TRM data, that's this one we created. Let's look at users. If we look at users, we'll notice there's no users here because we didn't set up a way to create a user in this database when you created one in the authentication database. This is one of those things where we kind of shortcutted the process and said, we'll get to that. And we never got to it. That's the problem of saying we'll get to that. You kind of have to do it then or you forget about it. Or you should document it. And we didn't document it either, and we should have. So now is the time to document it. Now is the time to do something about it. So I'm going to paste in that user ID. If you didn't have it from there, you could also go into your API auth DB, go to ASP.NET users, and find the ID of me there. Tim Corey, Tim at IamTimCorey.com. We can create these automatically when that user gets created. We might not because we don't necessarily want every user to be in this table. We're not sure. We should think that one through though and do something. So now that it's there, let's restart this process and see if we don't get a different result. We log in, and now that we do, we actually have our cart up. We have our end loop batteries. We can add a few to the cart. No more, we only have 5. We can add a few copies of finish to the cart. Hey, you know what? There's quite a few copies right there. And we can even check out. Cool. So with all that done, I think that our application is probably back up and running. So there's Tim. We can add the manager role. That works. We can remove the manager role. It looks like our application is up and running. And now we have something we can work with. We have something we can test and try out locally and not break anything. We know where the databases are going now because we created them. We know what's talking to what. We saw that in the code. And we even know some of the bugs that we had that we should probably address. So just getting up to speed allowed us to see some of those things. And this is where fresh eyes really helps. So if you're struggling with an application, walking away from it for a while and coming back to it, maybe not 2 or 3 months, but even a couple of days can kind of give you that fresh perspective on your application. Or better yet, if you have access to another developer, have them look at your code and listen to the questions they ask. Look at the struggles they have, and that will tell you where your pain points are that you need to address. In almost every case, one of the biggest pain points is probably going to be good documentation. Good documentation is really important, but overlooked by just about everyone, including myself, because it feels like it's not really work, right? It feels like you're not actually making progress. You're just writing documentation. That's not why you decide to become a developer. You didn't become a developer because you really like to write paragraphs of text. But at the same time, that's what makes your applications easier to use. It makes your applications easier to get started with, and it makes your fellow coworkers have an easier time working with your code. And that's a good thing. So documentation is really important, as we've seen here today. So if you're just getting started with this process, I'm sorry, the documentation is not great. We'll work on that, okay? But in the meantime, now you have a starter for at least what this application, how it started to work. We've got it at least up and running. So now you can test it. And that's the other important thing is you want to make sure that you have a development environment that you can test in. One that you can break stuff and nothing bad happens. In fact, you want a development environment where you can delete everything and start over without a problem, because you want to have the freedom to fail. Don't always plan on success. You want to plan for failure and be okay with that. So the idea that I know now how this is set up is helpful because now I can reset it back up. It'd be even better once I document it because it makes that process quicker. And the quicker the process is, the less fear I have about redoing it. So the more comfortable I am with saying, you know what, let's just blow it all away and start over again. Maybe it's a problem with my setup or my environment. Now, before we move on, I don't want to belabor this video too long, so I don't want to go too deep into anything else right now, but we did talk about that WPF bar that pops up that I really don't like that much. Let's turn that off. Let's go to Tools Options. And I'm not even sure where this is exactly in this whole list of options. But this search box up here, you type WPF, that's going to filter down to just the things that say WPF somewhere in them. So in here are some WPF things. And if I look through these, I don't see, it says WPF trace settings, which I don't think is right. And so I don't see what I'm looking for here. But don't get discouraged. Just think through. And the thing I'm thinking of is, you know what? This is really about XAML. It's really about the user interface part of WPF. And maybe it's not just WPF. It probably also is in UWP and maybe even in Xamarin. Not sure. So let's try XAML instead and see what we get. We have a lot more stuff for XAML, including the XAML designer, which is cool. There's a default split for the view, default orientation. That's kind of cool. How you zoom, really cool stuff in here. And if you're playing around with XAML, it might be a great time to go through here and kind of poke around and see what you're working with. But let's go look at in here under debugging for XAML, it says enable UI debugging tools for XAML, including the hot reload and just my XAML. If we uncheck that, I believe that's the issue. Let's start this again and see if that goes away. There we go. It's gone. So I'm going to leave that off, but if you like it, cool, leave it on. And the cool thing is go to Tools, Options, XAML, and check that box under the Debugging General to turn it on or off. All right, so now we're done with the XAML setup. I think we're going to stop almost there. But remember, I keep saying we need to add this to the list. We need to add this to the list. Well, we need to add this stuff to the list. So let's go back to our Azure DevOps. And the first thing we're going to do, come back here, we're going to create a couple of new work items. So let's create an issue. And this issue right here, I believe, if we go back to our work items, let's discard the changes for a minute. We say bug : if it's a bug. Otherwise, it say suggestion : for suggestions. This is our very simple issue list. It's not going to be the full featured issue list that some people might use, but we're a small shop. In fact, it's just me. So the issue, let's say bug, is that the tokens not working in Swagger. So we noticed that there was Swagger does not work with authentication, which makes it practically worthless. Let's fix that, okay? So we're gonna assign that to, well, me. All right, so let's save that and let's go back to our work items. So now we have a bug assigned to me. Let's assign one more work item, another issue. This is a suggestion, which is really a strong suggestion. In fact, I may even raise the priority level, but I haven't gotten there yet. So let's go with update document, startup documentation. So we need to document the process of starting up a new development system. Okay, that's really important to do. Let's go ahead and assign myself to that as well as the only person on the team. And let's hit save. So now we have that issue as well on our issue list. It's on our radar, which means that we can't say from now on, oh, I forgot about that. We have something in front of us that says, hey, remember this. And so we need to go through and actually make sure we do that at some point. And in fact, like I said, I might document this offline just because it's not necessarily something that you need to watch me do, but we may come back and talk through it at least, okay? So that's the process we go through to make sure that we don't forget these things. So we've got this startup process going. We've got the TimCo Retail Manager running. We can read through the code now and look at what it does. We can try things out and break things, and it's okay because it's a local dev machine and we know how to get started again. We're going to document that process to make it even quicker and ready for the next person to come along as well. All right, so now moving forward, we need to start looking at what do we add to the system, how do we make it work better, fix some of these bugs we might see, and also what new features do we need to add to make this even more complete, okay? So right now, there's still some pieces in here that aren't working. For example, the inventory is not being updated when we check things out. Well, we need to fix that, okay? The fact that our admin user is not being elevated immediately, or that users are not being brought over. Those are things we need to address. And then we need to keep working on making this a more full-featured application. Okay, so those are all coming up, along with, of course, new features and new systems, including, I'm thinking, probably WebAssembly for our Blazor WebAssembly for our UI for our web development side. We'll see. But until then, thanks for watching. Thanks for participating. And if you have more comments and questions, leave them down below. I love to hear all about them. All right. As always, I am Tim Corey.